some interesting issues have been raised throughout the presentations, and we're going to shift now into a slightly more informal discussion of those issues. But so first I'm going to turn it to Martin Senftleben, who's the director of IViR, the Institute for Information Law, at the University of Amsterdam. And Martin, you are free to comment on whatever you like, but some interesting discussion has been happening in the text on, what's the interplay with TRIPS, which explicitly states that you can have exceptions up to the Rome Convention. And I'm interested in thinking about, what does that mean if the broadcast treaty actually were to endorse exceptions beyond the Rome Convention? And what are we going to do with TRIPS?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. I don't want to take too much time because I guess there are many people here who would like to raise a couple of questions and points. Just some general observations. I think what we see in the WIPO discussion at the moment is that on the one hand, a new type of discussion is becoming more and more important, and this is on education and library users. And I think that this is a good development because that's an area where we see really an increasing need for clarity. In the chat, you find a study that I have written recently for the European Commission, where I can demonstrate that even in an advanced copyright system like the European Union copyright system, there are so many open questions and issues with regard to research use. And so quite clearly, there is a need for more guidance, more clarity at the international level. Nonetheless, I would say, with whatever initiative is taken forward at the international level, it is very important to assess carefully what kind of clarification and reassurance is really helpful for individual countries and users, and to which extent an initiative that focuses on very specific types of use would rather curtail instead of broaden the flexibility that you have in the end. Because after all, I mean, many of the main exclusive rights that are at issue, the right of reproduction, and in an online context, the right of making available that has been granted in the WIPO Copyright Treaty, can be limited quite flexibly under the international three-step tests of Article 9.2 of the Berne Convention and Article 10 of the WIPO Copyright Treaty. So if you now go into detail in a certain area, you may lose this broader flexibility. So that's always something, because I'm cautious in saying whatever can be translated into treaty language is a good development at the international level. If you think about the question of preservation copies, which is a relevant question, but as Dick has pointed out so brilliantly, the preservation copy as such is not very problematic. The question is how to then make this available to the broader public. And also, it's about the volume of preservation. The current discussion in Europe is very much about copying the entire internet in order to have traditional historical copies of what the internet was at a certain point in time. And there you reach a level of complexity that in national law is very often dealt with under specific national library legislation and placed outside of copyright altogether in that way. So if you now start an international discussion on this kind of preservation uses, you might lose some of the flexibility which traditionally has been in this area, because countries felt free to legislate under national library rules and then ensure the necessary interfaces with copyright legislation. And if we now make it 100% copyright issue, I'm not so sure if this is really the most promising and helpful approach. So I'm not saying that this new discussion is not important, and I'm not saying that it is not helpful, but I'm saying we must be careful in what we wish for. With regard to the broadcasting treaty, well, there we see very clearly the clash between the new upcoming discussion on exceptions and limitations and one of the long-standing older issues on the WIPO agenda. As we all know, the broadcasting treaty is really one of the most long-standing and traditional topics has kept the SCCR busy for years and years and years. And from that perspective, it doesn't come as a surprise that the proposal that we see in the area of exceptions and limitations does not reflect the new forward-looking approach that many people would like to see in the new initiatives, but instead we see the rather traditional approach saying exceptions must be specific, and on top of that saying even though they are specific, they must comply with the three-step test. So I can only confirm what earlier speakers have said. I have always been one of the commentators saying, if you already have a specific exception and you have international consensus on a specific type of exception, then it doesn't make any sense to apply the three-step test on top. Realistically speaking, we have very specific exception prototypes in the Marrakesh Treaty, and still the three-step test in the Marrakesh Treaty as a result of the Marrakesh miracle comes on top of that. So we see here a clash of approaches. And as Bernd Hürenholz says in his paper on the Broadcasting Treaty, which I recommend really for anybody interested in the topic as background literature, he says very clearly, well, if the Broadcasting Treaty can do something beneficial in the area of exceptions and limitations, then we should look for avenues to bring some of the new issues like uses for educational purposes, library purposes, text and data mining. I mean, journalistic activity increasingly depends on text and data mining of pre-existing audiovisual resources and so on. So we should try to implement this agenda into the Broadcasting Treaty, because then the Broadcasting Treaty could become the first forward-looking treaty that already takes a first step in the direction of regulating educational and library uses in a different way. But once again, my general caveat is that we have to evaluate carefully what kind of clarification and reassurance is really helpful and what kind of flexibilities are there under the three-step test that we have in 9.2 and 10 of the WIPO Copyright Treaty. And with that, I think I close my comment. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank you, Martin. Luis, I don't know if you want to comment on the implications of the TRIPS agreement, which you were raising, which does have a very interesting tie of the limitations and exceptions to the Rome Convention that's at once both more flexible but also somewhat confining. Do you want to say more about that, Luis?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you, Sean, for organizing this meeting and to the speakers. So with regard to Rome and broadcast and to your question, to my understanding, given that the nature of the scope of the right to broadcasters provided in Rome are much more limited in nature than the rights that are provided in the new proposal, most of the rights of the proposal will be not covered by Rome or TRIPS. And those new rights are the most problematic. So there is no obligation in TRIPS or Rome with regard to those new rights. Hence, the standard for limitations that are in Rome or TRIPS with regard to broadcaster rights are not applicable. So there is complete freedom for the new treaty to define what are the limits that member countries will have. So there is no need to ask permission to TRIPS, to be more explicit on new exceptions, because there is no obligation for those rights. So I think that's the beauty for us, is that we could define any type of standard to applying the new exception. So we will say, anything. I mean, this because it's complete uncharted matter. So I don't know if that responds what you are asking. And yes, and definitely, you have for related rights in general, the TRIPS provides Article 14, no Article 13 for limitations. So there's no three-step test unless for specific reproduction right for the phonograms.
And I'm reading your version of Article 14. It only applies to the members of the Rome Convention, it says, can apply the limitations and exceptions to the extent of the Rome Convention. But so for other members, it's open, as you say. It's Article 13.
What I'm saying that the Rome Convention is the standard, and the Rome Convention do not provide the three-step test to anyone, unless you are talking to the rights that are similar to copyright, and hence will apply only to the reproduction right, which is on the Rome. I'm sorry, on Bern for three-step test. The three-step test, in general, starts with the TRIPS and WIPO, so not Bern.
And Jamie, do you want to jump back in? I mean, you said kind of two things. One thing you mentioned was that you thought a lot of the issues with LNE would be drastically reduced if the fixation right, which is kind of reappeared into Article 7 of the draft treaty, was eliminated. I don't know if you want to comment more on that, or you also had some comments that's kind of TRIPS plus nature of the.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely the post-fixation rights are the problem with this agreement, and from our point of view, and I think
Would you say that this draft has post-fixation rights? Like it tries to make the argument that it's only fixing the signal at the point of signal. It's not applying anything after.
Well, people should not adopt a treaty where they don't know the answer to that question. And I think it's you just read the notes of the Brussels Convention, where that was also something that they felt they didn't really have an answer to. I mean, if you have the exclusive right to fixation, and someone didn't get your permission for that fixation, and then they rebroadcast it, and someone fixes that and they don't get your permission for that fixation, and that goes on for a while, then you have like 12, maybe 100 different fixation rights attached with whatever content you get. And so that person then is infringing because they have made a copy without your permission. And if they've made a copy without your permission, whatever remedies are available, this thing's a bit weak on the remedy side, but it's going to be treated like other types of infringement. Probably it's going to be some mixture of criminal and fines and injunctions. So yeah, it's a pretty highly problematic thing. The other thing I want to mention, we have a separate. We were asked by USDR to make a submission on the Bern 3-step test as it relates to news of the day and public affairs in the special 301 process. So we prepared like pretty long comment on that, which we'll share later today, as soon as we finish our proofing on it. But one thing I just want to point out is that in the one case in the WTO about the 3-step test was DS 160, and that was on the U.S. broadcasting of broadcaster rights as it relates to like bars and eating establishments. And the question was that exception in the Bern Convention, which is 11 bis, was that exception that's permitted there, was that subject to the 3-step test? And the panel found that 11 bis, which would apply to other exceptions in the Bern Convention, including the quotation, teaching, and all sorts of other things, news of the day, that because it had a separate treatment than the reproduction right, it was not subject to the 3-step test. And the only reason why the WTO 3-step test came into play was that the US didn't comply with 11 bis. And they were essentially asking for an exception to an exception. Now, the practical meaning of this, if you can follow this, because it's an important point, what the panel found is the three-step test in the WTO agreement expanded the scope of exceptions. It took everything you could already do with a specific exception in the Berne Convention, and you could do even more if it satisfied the three-step test. So the three-step test was Berne exceptions plus, not Berne exceptions minus.
It's a great last comment to consider as we wrap up our session. Let me thank each of our speakers for joining us today, and to Martin for commenting, and for all of you to attending. I'm not going to shift off the recording